what Richard is proposing and what has become very popular, and it's not even just Richard alone. There have been other analysts who have also kind of been propagating this kind of theory. He's proposing essentially that this essentially means that the United States is now going to become the country that's going to dominate oil and LNG exports. The United States itself doesn't have the energy it needs to meet its own demands, yet somehow we have this prevailing argument that the United States is going to produce enough for itself to fuel Europe, to fuel in terms of oil, right? And but also, the Gulf states by taking out competitors and becoming the world's, kind of major oil giant. No, it doesn't work like that. And it becomes even more ambitious when we say the United States is trying to become the world's major oil exporter. And like I said at the beginning of this conversation, this is an argument that Trump himself has kind of fueled, because he's basically come out and said, the world can buy oil from us. Everybody can just buy oil for it. We've got abundance amount of oil. But this is the thing. These arguments collapse because, and I've said this before,
All right, good day, everyone. We are here with another show with a special guest, Elina Xenophontos. We have seen Elina, of course, often on Colonial Outcasts. That's how I know you. I've also read some of your work on Substack. Now, you have some interesting theory of what is going on regarding the whole energy situation and the Iran war. But before we do that, I think most of our subscribers will probably know you. But maybe you can introduce yourself a bit for our audience before we dive into it.
yeah, of course. This is probably the thing that I'm least expertise at, is talking about myself, but I'll do my best. So basically, yeah, I'm an international law and globalization specialist, particularly economic globalization. That's what my specialty is, and now I basically work as geopolitical analyst. Much like Kareem said, I speak on multiple different platforms, whether it's on Colonial Outcast, or I could be on, I'm also frequently now, recently on Danny Haifeng, among other kind of platforms, Dimitris Laskaris, to kind of break down geopolitical events that are transpiring in a way that's digestible to the audience. And much like Karim said, I do a lot of work which can be found on Substack, a lot of written pieces, articles, which are kind of more like little mini theses, because they're quite elaborate for the most part. And my whole goal is to use my knowledge of international law and economics, which is essentially, sort of the um, studying how macroeconomics functions and how laws impact macroeconomics at the international scale, and sort of helping people understand, because at the end of the day, what all events that are occurring around the world are pretty much based on economic material interests and profit. It's the economic sort of need to meet to meet profit expectations that defines our political economy around the world and what we understand as globalization. So that's kind of what I do. And yeah, like you said, a lot of my work can be found on Substack, as well as other platforms like my Patreon, etc. And I also do actually have a YouTube page, although it hasn't been utilized in the way that I would have liked. But I do have some in-depth kind of video analyses on there, for those that are interested.
Great, great. So I can actually, so we can do a YouTube collaboration later on when we upload it. Great.
Yeah.
Elina, welcome, and let's jump right into it. I saw a wall post of yours a while back where you deconstructed a theory that we recently often see in the anti-imperialist sphere about the fact that everything that's happening, or everything, a lot that is happening in West Asia, the attacks on the Gulf states, the destruction of these oil and gas facilities, etc., is part of a grand plan by the United States to acquire, you could say, kind of LNG dominance in the energy sphere, global energy sphere. And I found that theory first very convincing. I saw the first time Richard Medhurst proposing that theory in a very long monologue on his channel. I wrote an article even about it on our Substack, in which I agreed with many of his points, but then I saw that he omitted one very important point, and that is, of course, the transition to clean energy. I think he also did not really think about that aspect, and that it speeds it up, of course, what is happening. But then you went way more in detail. I think I also saw you discuss it on Radhika Desai's show. I'm not sure, but I think you discussed it there. And um, I also saw some of our comrades at the Resistance is Fertile podcast who actually said, who were also very much disagreed with that, uh, or very much disagreed with that theory, in the sense that it is a kind of internalized omnipotence of the West, where even when the West Asia is bombed to smithereens, including American bases, that is still part of the grand plan, because that way America will get energy dominance and everybody will shift to LNG and America will be the hegemon and that kind of stuff, which of course is a good point. You talked about Dimitri. Well, brother Dimitri is often here on our show. He is also not convinced by that theory. So before I talk too long, Elina, can you tell us a bit what that theory is that Richard Medhurst came with, that's really spreading like wildfire, by the way, in the anti-imperialist sphere, and why you think that theory is not viable, is not correct?
So, I mean, you kind of covered it, but to break it down or like synopsize it as much as possible, what Richard is proposing and what has become very popular, and it's not even just Richard alone, there have been other analysts who have also kind of been propagating this kind of theory, is that essentially that the United States in its I guess imperialist wars in against Iran, but also against Russia, among other places, including what occurred in Venezuela. Obviously, the kidnapping of President Maduro, and the way that essentially the United States controls now the entire oil industry and financial industry of Venezuela. Again, he's proposing essentially that this essentially means that the United States is now going to become the country that's going to dominate oil and LNG exports. And this is obviously fueled by statements of, President Trump has made is, oh, you don't, if you need oil, you can buy oil from us. You don't need the oil from the Gulf states. And it kind of really goes into that. It really fuels that narrative that the United States is becoming the world's global energy major exporter. Um, and in doing so, it's essentially securing its own hegemony and demoralizing, if you like, its the economies of its adversaries, that being Iran, Russia, and ultimately the goal is China. And he actually concludes that effectively this will undermine China's even industrial capacity, because it would need to require LNG and oil for its own industrial base to produce its, to maintain its own industrial base from the United States. And ultimately, they will need to buy more dollars, therefore fueling the American empire in order to have access to the energy resources that it needs in order to be able to sustain itself. And so this is a major defeat. And the way Richard is presenting it is the United States has essentially won or has been successful in those goals. And this is the thing, the way I would present it is that there are significant differences between having goals and having them being materialized, or to what extent they can be materially applied. And yes, I would agree that the United States, for example, can you still hear me, by the way, because I've noticed that my screen has frozen? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
um,
It's a local recording, so you will probably be fine later on.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't lose you guys. But yeah, so there are, material limitations, as I was saying. And although I would agree with Richard that ultimately, at the end of the day, the United States goal is to diminish, weaken China, is to sustain its hegemony. They are trying to rain destruction and to weaken its adversaries by weakening Iran, destroying projects like the BRI, taking over Venezuela and obstructing China's investments in future oil exploration and other major investments in mineral resources, as well as obviously Venezuela also presents much like Cuba, a doorway into the Americas, into the like the American market, so to speak, especially as they were also part of the BRI project. So we can see that the United States goal is to weaken all these, alternative financial and trade infrastructure that BRICS and the BRI are basically forming under the leadership of China, especially, but also, of course, Russia and Iran together. We can all agree to this. We know that this is obviously the goal. But I guess, yes, my fundamental disagreement is that when you start to actually break down um, the arguments he's making with regards to, can the United States be the world supplier of oil? Can the United States be the world supplier of LNG? Um, can the United States be able to sustain that, that output that is necessary to meet the needs of its own needs, especially at the time of increased investment in AI data centers, and other, other, technical related, rather industry, sorry, other investment in the tech industry, such as, um, you know, uh, semiconductor fabs, among other things. Are they able to sustain the energy that they need, as well as to provide for the EU, as well as for their Asian allies? And when we start to look at that, the United States material limitations, its own industrial capacity, and how well it can meet that said demand, will things begin to change? And also, what do we mean and what do we understand when we talk about exporting oil? Not all oil is made the same. The same thing can apply for LNG and how that operates. So, this is, I guess, where my major disagreements are. And where I find that the argument can become weak, but obviously we'll break it down as we go along.
I muted you, Peter, for background noise.
So the question I wanted to ask is kind of to shift over to the broader role that oil plays in the war. But before we get there, a more particular question. There was one other the aspect. I first of all completely agree with your perspective on this. When I read the this theory, it seemed like, well, certainly there would be people in the U.S. government who would want that, but the idea that this is like a fully fledged, currently successful plan just seemed, far beyond the evidence available. But one aspect was the view of the petrodollar and the idea that there might be an LNG dollar. And I just wanted to point out, like, the area that I found that lacking, and you might have a different angle in which you can step in and explain your thinking. But the thing with the petrodollar is not just that uh, oil being priced in dollars means that other countries need to accumulate dollars, or at least have dollars on hand to buy this absolutely essential import. That is part of it. But another huge part of it is preventing kind of the basic economic, well, what you would learn in an econ class, which is not really real world, but what you would nonetheless still learn in an econ class, which is, if the US were running consistent trade deficits with all of these oil exporting countries, you would expect the kind of equilibrium. We'd be reaching towards an equilibrium by the US dollar dropping in value versus the currencies of the countries exporting the oil. But because the US made a deal with these countries, whereby instead of taking these dollars and just selling them on FX markets, which would have that negative effect on the value of the US dollar, or using those dollars to buy controlling stakes in important companies, instead the deal was the oil exporters would use those dollars for purchasing minor stakes in major companies and stock indices, and just in the main, using them just to buy treasury securities, just to buy US debt. So recycling those dollars. So that was a key part of the petrodollar concept that isn't captured in the idea of an LNG dollar, other than, countries that, if the US were to dominate that market, which it's not doing, or probably won't do completely. But perhaps before we get into like the real role oil plays in the war, do you have any other thoughts on how the kind of currency angle should be correctly understood?
Yeah, so you make a very important point. when people talk about the petrodollar, like you said, the most important aspect behind it is that we see a recycling of the money that especially the Gulf states make with regards to the selling of oil and even LNG, but especially oil. The huge surplus that they make in terms of profits is then invested back into the United States in, like you said, in small stakes in major companies, but also in major investment projects. And something that I often refer back to because it is very significant, especially for the United States in this point in time, is obviously the deals that Trump had obviously gone and he had toured around the Gulf states earlier last year, to basically, actually this time last year, around April last year, and basically established all these deals with major tech companies, and that all the Gulf states would basically use their sovereign wealth funds to invest in, the Silicon Valley industry and
Mm.
AI, among other things. So when you start looking at the fact that this was billions, if in fact trillions even, were committed to, or obviously within sections, to be invested into the United States towards their data centers, towards their tech industry. And this is very important for the United States, for instance, when they're talking about winning the AI race. This becomes a perfect example of how that money, which is going to be put into the United States to both deal with its deficit, but also to help its own industry sustain themselves that otherwise wouldn't have been able to, because it is, after all, a deficit country. And we also have to remember that the United States is a deficit country because it has become a financial capitalist state, and it must be the world's consumer. It has to purchase from, it has to be a major importer of goods and services. In order to keep pumping out the dollar. But in order to balance that out, they need that major investment in capital, in American capital, and also obviously, like you said, buying out the US treasuries in order to keep afloat.
Oh,
And so in
yeah.
many ways, yeah. And so, like, actually, it's the rest of the world that in a way is kind of fueling American imperialism because of the way the financial structure is set up. So with regards to this kind of proposition now of, especially the idea of wiping out the competition in the Gulf monarchies, whether it's LNG or whether it's oil, and replacing that, with with the United States oil exports or LNG, and then creating the Petrogas dollar. This becomes a problem because you are now essentially, I mean, if you were to impose a kind of economic war almost on the Gulf states, you're essentially bleeding them dry. You're going to essentially start breaking down their economy, and all that excess surplus, in profits that they make that would have otherwise been invested in your own economy. And this is very important to the United States because, in my humble opinion, the Gulf monarchies have been single-handedly one of the most important pillars of the U.S. petrodollar.
Mm.
And when that becomes threatened, so does the petrodollar itself. And when that happens, the dollar loses, like you said, value. Going forward, it no longer is going to be considered a valuable asset to hold. Well, obviously, this is further along, right? It's not going to happen instantly overnight. It will happen gradually, and then when that happens, we're going to see a greater desire, especially from countries of the global south, to diversify, especially now that there are actually options to do so. So this is as well another, I think, issue when we're talking about this, when we're this kind of proposition of the petrogas dollar, that Richard is proposing. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'm trying to come up with a way to ask this question that it's more reasonably like bounded instead of this massive open-ended question. But what I want to ask you is just what is the role of oil and fossil fuels more generally in this war? But maybe before such a huge question, I could ask something a little more specific. I've also heard people, I don't think this is Medhurst at all, but I've definitely heard people online talk about the oil reserves in Venezuela as if the what is it, the Orinco or something like that, the basin, there's a basin in Venezuela that supposedly has like the most proven barrels of oil of any country in the world. But the aspect that I don't often hear about that is the incredibly high cost of actually extracting it, such that even if the US had total control over the Venezuelan government, the ability to actually get a return on investment by extracting that oil really depends on oil being extremely expensive, like more expensive than it is right now, maybe closer to like 150 $200 a barrel. So do you is that right, or how do you see the kind of geopolitical importance of having those oil reserves in Venezuela maybe de facto under U.S. control?
Right. So yeah, this is actually something that I'm actually writing about it now, and you did say to discuss the fact that I am writing quite an extensive piece on this, which will be published in the form of like a bit of a mini booklet because it turned out being such a major such a major piece. But this is a thing. Yes, the United States has effectively taken control over Venezuela, given the fact that all its revenues, its bank accounts, all of it is basically now controlled by the Federal Reserve, including their major state-owned company, oil kind of refineries and companies. So that's all controlled now by the United States, and they get to dictate how that oil and that wealth is going to be used, when it's going to be used. Even the Venezuelan state doesn't have immediate access to those funds unless the United States permits it to do so. So of course they have significant control, and we can, on another. This is obviously a time and place for that, but there is a huge, sort of legal question that could also be, that can be broken down as to that should also be addressed, but. We'll leave that to a side. But yes, the United States now is in control of Venezuela. But much like you said, um, the reality of the situation is that after years, after a couple of decades now, if not more, almost 3 decades of and all these sanctions and economic warfare and forms of embargo against a very poor country. Venezuela was a poor country, and it was allowed to, be, retain that kind of level of poverty fundamentally because of the United States prior to obviously Chavez, and turning it into basically nothing more than an oil production rentier state that didn't actually that saw no real benefits, as in it didn't really see the fruits of the profits. For the most part, they just extracted certain royalties, a certain amount from the royalties, but they were not able to then diversify, and everything was kind of dictated by American oil companies and other European companies that were inside of Venezuela. So Venezuela is a poor country as it was, and then obviously when the economic warfare began with the sanctions, this caused the amount of its infrastructure to deteriorate significantly. And this is where the crux of the problem lies, because in order to start seeing any sort of value to the oil, to the abundant amount of oil, which, yes, Venezuela is the richest country in oil reserves and untapped oil in the world. However, how they're supposed to extract that oil is another story. Most of the infrastructure has been destroyed, and the United States or any country or company or major corporation that would want to extract said oil would need to invest. And the numbers vary, right? The numbers that I'm seeing so far are a minimum of 110 billion, and they would need a decade at minimum to start seeing any sort of actual payback, as in to actually see any sort of results from that major investment. And then the other aspect behind it is the political, sort of instability and that Venezuela has, and to what degree there are going to be these legal protections for these oil giants and corporations in order to actually invest inside of Venezuela. So there is a huge reluctancy because it's a lot of money from a cross benefit analysis with not guaranteed results. And actually, just last night, I saw a piece that was published by Reuters, and I actually still have it here. And what it basically argues. Oh, now, well, let me have access for some reason. Yesterday I was able to read it, but now it's paywalled. But basically, what they're arguing that even under the reforms that Venezuela has actually put forward, um, most oil companies are still reluctant to actually invest into Venezuela. It's basically saying that Trump's so-called victory and all these reforms that he's kind of gloating about are not actually materializing in any specific way. So again, when we're talking about, yes, Venezuela has been taken over. Yeah, it has. It was a massive defeat. It was a massive defeat for especially leftist movements and the anti-imperialist struggle. I guess globally, it was a defeat. But to what extent that defeat will actually alter the current course of events in favor of the United States is very questionable. I in fact would argue that the greatest loss is more so in the context of all the money that China has invested inside of Venezuela, which now all that money is kind of essentially considered frozen assets and controlled by the United States that forbids Venezuela from working with China. So that's that money that several, I think, millions, not billions, yeah, have been, I can't remember the exact number now, have been invested inside of Venezuela for oil infrastructure, building trains, industrializing the country, has now essentially come to a halt. And this creates another, again, these are, there are legal issues surrounding this, but I think that's the greatest loss to China. And one last little point about that: when people talk about, oh, well, now China has lost a partner in terms of its own oil imports. Well, China was only importing about 3% of its oil from Venezuela to begin with. So this is not going to be a major loss. Like I said, the most important thing for China was the investments that now are basically under American control.
Mm.
Right. So then I'm gonna ask you a bit of a broad question. So then we have the other school of thought, Elina, where they say that the Iran war is actually a tremendous blunder, a tremendous mistake by the United States, turning Iran pretty much slowly into a superpower, or actually speeding it up. I say slowly, but some will say it's actually speeding up, turning Iran into a superpower. How do you see that? Do you also, and there are a lot of people. I mean, we're talking about ex members of empire, the older men who are now in the independent media sphere, doing a lot of commenting. Um, they are saying that this is a tremendous blunder by the United States. Iran is taking over the Strait of Hormuz. So that is pretty much the opposite idea of what Richard Medhurst would say. Are you more in agreement with that idea?
Yeah, I am. So I'll say exactly why, and then also I'm gonna break down, because I do want to get back to also what Peter asked with regards to oil and how the oil industry overall works, and the United States becoming a major oil, I guess, replacement of of the Gulf monarchies. So with regards to that, I would tend to fall into the camp of the latter kind of theory, I guess. And the reason I say that is fundamentally because I think, when you look at what's happened, the United States has obviously gone into war with Iran. It has spent, according to them, 25 billion in terms. This was the military expenditure. Recently, I was reading a report that's come out that said that the war overall against Iran, with regards to military expenditure, but also in terms of oil, inflation, and the overall increase in prices, and the damage to the American economy, has cost American families in the United States around 100 billion in just a couple of months. This is a country that in itself is facing. A fiscal crisis, a debt crisis, that is, it's suffering under, it's collapsing a little bit under its own contradictions. And what has it been able to accomplish with regards to Iran? I mean, this is what we have to ultimately look at. Has it been able to accomplish, has it gotten rid of the so-called nuclear threat and its military threat to the region, which is, the prevailing narrative, although we all understand that's kind of more of a front, but more so than anything else? No, they haven't. We saw recent reports come out that's basically stated that internal CIA documents have found that, in fact, the vast majority, I think 75 to 80% of their ballistic missiles of Iran are still very much intact. Most of its arsenal is very much intact. Around 95% of its underground, I guess, warehouses and military bases and nuclear facilities have actually been instantly rebuilt. So where does that leave us? It actually leaves us to the point that the United States is pretty much at the same place it was when this war started. And not just that, it's actually worse fundamentally because now Iran has become, has established itself, yes, has shown itself to be quite a powerful state, quite a power in the region, but it's now changed the entire, I guess, uh, reality of these of the Strait of Hormuz, and this is very important because now you have Iran effectively saying we're going to control the Strait of Hormuz, and that is something that Iran is refusing to budge on. Essentially, in all these negotiations, irrespective of the war, irrespective of the economic warfare through the U.S. Blockade that's been imposed on the Strait of Hormuz, specifically against Iranian trade and vessels, irrespective of all of this, Iran is still, insisting on this point primarily because it is the victor in this war, and it understands that it needs to have control over the Strait of Hormuz because it also allows it not only to secure itself politically and militarily, but also economically, especially given the fact that it's a sanctioned state. By tolling the Strait of Hormuz, it allows Iran to be able to accumulate the finances and the wealth necessary to be able to, I guess, offset the impact of these sanctions, but it also does give them political and economic leverage and control over its adversaries, and could become a bargaining chip on the table when it comes to reducing, or rather, maybe even completely ending the sanctions regime against the state. And there is nothing that the United States or its allies can actually do to stop this. And we're already seeing countries like Japan, and even EU states that have paid the toll just to pass through the Strait of Hormuz because it is absolutely essential to the world economy. And then you have the United States saying, well, obviously doing so is a violation of international law because this is international waters. And then it becomes all the more laughable. I mean, sure, one could argue that legally, but then, I mean, the United States it's constantly violating international law. I mean, if we were to sit and make a list, we'll be here for at least several days. So, the reality is, yes, perhaps they're breaking international law, or there's a violation of international law, but that can be resolved through the establishment of international treaty that would say otherwise. And if Iran persists on that point, that can actually lead to a form of capitulation. So this is one of the most important aspects, and that is the changing of the dynamics of the Strait of Hormuz, the control that Iran now has over one of the most fundamental, trade choke points in the world, how it even has major impacts and influence on American allies, such as, the EU or countries in East Asia who rely on the Strait of Hormuz for their own industrial capacity, their own economies, and who are now desperate. And that obviously puts a bit of a strain on the United States and its relations with these countries, if as the war continues, because I mean, politically, but also economically. And something as well that we also have to remember, and we'll get into more so a little bit later, is that the United States itself depends on the industrial supply chains of a lot of these countries for its own, to build its own infrastructure, but especially with regards to, its AI race, its aerospace industry, its the overall tech industry. It relies on the vast majority of supply chains come from places like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and they are now struggling as a result of the war in the Strait of Hormuz. So that's going to add more pressure into the United States. So I would say, yes, Iran has come out of this far stronger, and I wouldn't agree with the idea that the United States essentially is the one that is winning this war. And in fact, even pieces published by, like, even the Atlantic recently, was titled, that the United States is essentially put in a position of checkmate, where militarily they've depleted themselves. That's the other angle behind this as well. The United States is running low on munitions, ballistic missiles, GPS guided missiles, the more advanced technology, which is also the more expensive technology. They also have to now meet the demands of, the EU markets, which have been demilitarized as a result of the Ukraine-Russia war and are in high demand, for to replenish their own military stockpiles, and have invested. I think the EU alone has invested something like 1 trillion in its own defense industries, and all of that is supposed to be going into the coffers of American capital. Yet somehow the United States is supposed to produce the kind of weapons, munitions that it needs for itself, for its own imperialist ambitions abroad, to sustain its bases, to supply its NATO allies, but also to its Asian allies. Because, we've also seen that where a lot of, military hardware and defense systems were redirected and sent to West Asia, where they were ultimately destroyed. And the last thing, the United States bases inside the entire region have been weakened. essentially. I mean, that's all of them. Most of them have been destroyed or, damaged rather significantly, and they need those bases in order to. I mean, it's an integral part of their imperialist control. You need those bases to be able to, spy, carry out military operations abroad. I mean, we're seeing that play out now with Iran, right? So how has the United States, come out victorious in this war? I'm not quite sure. I would therefore say that Iran has come out more a bit far stronger. I was going to get into oil, how the oil, I guess, markets work, but I don't know if there's anything you guys want to ask or add on to what I said there before I
No,
get into that.
the only thing I'd want to add on is that you reminded me of the fact that the U.S. government is bitching about international law reminds me of a Chinese saying, which is it's like a sex worker preaching chastity. And then the other thing is like when it comes to these theories about like what's going on in the world, I would just caution people who recently got into politics. There's a saying: the purpose of a system is what it does, and it's a very cute saying, and I like it. It's very very cute. But it basically is just a semantic sleight of hand because it's just redefining purpose as whatever the hell a system does. But I think you just provided an excellent example of uh, I think it should be clear to people that the purpose of this war was not to leave Iran with a stronger position than it had previously. Oftentimes, purposes are frustrated, even among powerful people, powerful institutions, powerful governments. And I think the case you just laid out is a very strong case indicating that yes, in this case, the purpose of this system is not at all what happened. The purpose was completely frustrated by the Iranian military, largely. But yeah, if you could go into a little bit more, you hinted at some really interesting threads before. Um, I think that question about hey Alina, what is the role of oil in this war might be a little bit too broad, but maybe if you could touch on some of those threads about and this is something I haven't really followed that much, just how much of the AI bubble in the US is contributed to by these Gulf states and their oil money. And if that is being crimped now, what sort of near term impact that might make on the AI bubble. Maybe if you could also touch on, do you think it actually would help if people did a kind of GameStop routine where they tried to get all of their friends to put whatever little savings they have into oil futures to try to bump the
Oh
price up.
dear.
But whatever.
Oh dear. Uh, yeah, go on.
No, I just wanted to give you like ask you for a few threads to touch on.
Okay, so what's the role of oil in this war? So, yeah, I mean, Iran, first of all, going back to Iran, it's an oil-rich country. It's an oil-rich country that has essentially kicked out the United States, kicked out American corporations in 1979, and has taken, control over its own wealth. And that was obviously unacceptable to the United States because Iran, much like Saudi Arabia, up until 1979, was part of the two pillars of American capitalism in West Asia because they're oil rich states and very powerful countries for that matter. But that was essentially eliminated. In fact, that's also why the United States took an even bigger interest in Israel going forward. Because of the loss of Iran. That's just one angle of it. Obviously, it's not the complete picture. But then the thing is, Iran in its current state, the fact that it's forming international relations now and economic and trade relations with countries like China, with countries like Russia, and we're no longer in 2000, in the year 2000 or 1995. We're in the era of BRICS. We're in the era of establishing things like the Belt and Road Initiative and establishing new financial infrastructure like BRICS Bridge, which basically, as they're we're able to bypass the U.S. financial system almost entirely. So countries like Iran are now able to bypass U.S. sanctions and enter into the world trade gradually, because of course these mechanisms are still growing and evolving. We're still at the earlier stages, but they are growing rather rapidly. This will allow a country like Iran, that has been essentially economically strangulated since 1979, to be able to grow, export its oil, and become far more powerful. So the one aspect behind that is this would mean that all the sanctions warfare, the economic warfare on Iran, in order to be able to coerce it to capitulate to American corporate interests, would cease to exist. And we already saw after the nuclear deal in 2015, even though it was a very short term kind of ease of sanctions and up until 2017, 2018, and that wasn't an ease of all sanctions. It was just on some sanctions. Other sanctions still remained in place, especially with the sanctions with regards to, like, humanitarian. Sorry, can you hear me?
Hmm.
Oh, yeah, sorry, my screen went all black. So I
Oh.
apologize about that. It just my whole laptop went black. I thought it shut down. But to continue my point, yeah, so the my point, yes, so with regards to, as I was saying, Iran's capacity to grow, as I said, in 2015, when the sanctions were partially lifted, we already saw Iran make kind of enormous economic strides in a very short period of time. And in fact, I've often said this, like, even by 2016, 2017, they had almost accomplished establishing universal health care, which was eventually completely kind of bulldozed when Trump kind of reimposed the sanctions in 2018. So we can see how even a slight change in their lifting of sanctions was able to allow Iran to become more economically self-sufficient, more powerful, and in doing so, that would completely diminish any sort of leverage the United States would try to use to essentially bring it within to its own area of control and influence. In addition to that, because it's such an oil-rich country, and I've actually referenced this before, the fact that it's working alongside countries like China and Russia. Russia itself is an oil and gas-rich country. It's actually the richest country in terms of overall resources in the world. What would this mean in terms of the petrodollar, as countries, as very rich, resource rich and commodity rich countries, are not going to be able to trade in currencies outside the dollar? This would have included Venezuela as well, China, Russia, Iran, obviously. Then you've got countries now that are also part of BRICS, like Nigeria, who's also very rich in resources. This would essentially, put a strain on the petrodollar. It wouldn't eliminate it, but it would definitely sort of accelerate its weakening. I guess global control and influence, which, as we said in the earlier part of this conversation, the demand for the dollar is fundamental to the U.S. economy, because it helps balance its trade deficit, but also fuel its economy. It's keep a artificial control over its own debt, and continue to fund its imperialist wars abroad. Now, what happens when you have these powerful, rich oil countries and gas exporting countries, or the world's industrial superpower, all coming together, trading among themselves in currencies that are no longer the dollar, in order to bypass the U.S. financial system? You're weakening the very, the backbone of the American economy, that is the petrodollar in itself. This is also another angle behind why the war in Iran initiated, and what role oil plays in this sort of conversation. And actually, just a quick little statistic, which I always found very interesting, is that if you actually take collectively all the um, oil reserves within the Gulf monarchies, they come to about 28% of the world's global oil reserves. But if you take what was, if Venezuela was still within BRICS, Venezuela, Iran, China, Russia alone, they together account for, it was, I think, 33% of the world's oil reserves. So imagine if these countries, if Venezuela was continuing to evolve, the investments were going to improve the infrastructure, we would have seen greater amounts of oil exploration, obviously, in the future. Then Iran continues to economically grow, and watching them collaborate in terms of trading in oil and other resources in their own currencies, this would completely have shifted the balance of powers. And that was something that the United States could not accept, as well as, of course, the fact that Iran was also, a central point for the BRI in establishing, the digital Silk Road, as I say, which again is important in terms of like AI in the AI race and war. So the idea was to target Iran, to destroy all of that, to weaken it. And they thought that, that they were going to coerce Iran now through this war by inflicting as much damage as possible on the economy and its people, that they were going to surrender and basically, give in to all the United States demands, much like Venezuela did. That's what they thought. But obviously that hasn't happened. But this is how important Iran's role is, especially as its location, the fact that it's a large country, but the fact that it's an oil exporting country within a world that's now moving towards another direction. A new world is being born through China, and that was unacceptable to the United States. Now, with regards to the U.S., however, now there's been a lot of arguments, that this war, these sort of I guess, proposals that have been made and theories that, well, this war has obviously cut off oil from the Gulf monarchies, which, of course, it has been significantly diminished. It's trying to strangulate or prevent Iran from selling its oil. It's in doing so, it's trying to break Iran, and obviously we also know that China and Iran have a special kind of trade agreement with regards to oil. They provide China with a discounted oil, and China obviously provides lucrative, financial compensation, which helps the Iranian economy. And so the other argument is there that, oh, in doing so, they're actually, again, the United States is targeting China. Sure. Then it becomes even more ambitious when we say the United States is trying to become the world's major oil exporter. And like I said at the beginning of this conversation, this is an argument that Trump himself has kind of fueled, because he's basically come out and said, the world can buy oil from us. Everybody can just buy oil for it. We've got abundance amount of oil. But this is the thing. These arguments collapse because, and I've said this before, the oil that is produced by the United States, firstly, not all oil is made the same. You've got sweet oil, light crude, sorry. We've got medium and heavy crude. And all of these different types of oils, they do function differently. They are used for different purposes. And actually, if we break it down, most global world refineries are actually tailored to the production of heavy and medium crude as opposed to light sweet crude. And the United States, for itself, it's 80% of its exports of oil, because yes, since 2018, since 2019, it has been a net exporter of oil. It has been light sweet crude. That is the fundamental, like the most, like the baseline for when we're talking about the American oil exports. Yes, they have an abundant amount of oil, but they have light sweet crude that can only be used, sure, for certain jet fuel, etc. Yes, it can be used for that in that context, but it cannot be used in terms of heavy building of infrastructure, especially where we're talking about the fact that they were trying to build 1,500 data centers in the next year to 2 years in the United States, and they're trying to increase the amount of infrastructure and building, semiconductor fabs and LNG plants and all these other energy orientated plants that they're trying to establish in order to boost their own energy kind of use. The United States needs heavy crude oil, and not only for that purpose, but it also needs it for its own refineries, because around 70% of its own refineries were kind of made, especially on the Gulf Coast, were established, built in order to, refine heavy and medium crude, especially from Venezuela, but also as well from, West Asia and so forth. And that is also why, although the United States is exporting, yes, a large amount of sweet, sweet light crude, it's also importing an enormous amount of heavy and medium crude, particularly from West Asia, but especially from Canada. In fact, has a dependency on Canadian oil because it needs that to keep its own refineries working. It needs it for its own industrial base and manufacturing, especially as it goes into the era of mass building energy, infrastructure and AI and all, everything that I've obviously discussed up until this point.
Quick,
So the
quick
United
question.
States, yeah,
Quick
go on.
question just about that one point. I was always wondering why the US built these refineries for heavy crude, like from Venezuela or Canada, maybe Mexico as well, I don't know, but not its own light sweet crude. Is that, and this is just a pure guess, is that because there's actually more value added for that more difficult kind of refining? So the idea here, like in much of the economic system, is let's keep all of the high value added production and leave the lower value added production to foreigners, or is that not really relevant here?
So there's two things. So it's mostly. It's mostly because when oil was first discovered and the drilling process began in obviously like the early 1920s onwards, it was mostly heavy oil, heavy and medium crude, especially from Venezuela. So a lot of the refineries were built specifically to target that particular form of oil and to produce that particular form of oil. Light sweet crude is actually a more new, modernized form of oil production. So and yet to tailor or to build the kind of refineries in order to basically mass produce light sweet crude, it would actually be would be a multi-billion-dollar sort of investment that, well, a lot of these companies are not willing to make because they don't want to see any slashes in their own profit margins. So this is just how they kind of basically operate. So this is one of the reasons why they don't actually start to build these kind of refineries that are necessary. So this is the one fundamental reason, and that is the oil medium heavy crude was the old sort of standard form of oil before light sweet was actually they began to know how to produce it. And the thing here as well, when we're talking about the refineries in the Gulf states, in the US, it's actually quite expensive for them. They actually work at a loss when they use their own refineries to basically, refine light sweet crude because it's not tailored towards that. So it actually does cost them a lot of money. So they actually do need heavy crude as well and medium crude, not just for their own industrial base and their own economy, but also to even keep their own refineries working and not at a loss for that matter. And obviously, there are people that are even more specialized in this that could discuss it too in its more technical format, right? But this is the argument that I'm trying to make is more so the United States in this instance, when we're talking about becoming a world oil exporter and power, it doesn't have the capacity to do so logistically, materially. And then the other angle here as well that often gets kind of missed is the fact that the United States for itself, and we're seeing an enormous amount of kind of research papers and articles now being published in the last couple of years, it's facing a form of energy crisis, meaning essentially that based on the amount of AI data centers that it's trying to build, and this is very important. The fact that it's also trying to rapidly increase, LNG terminal sort of infrastructure and plants, among other projects, like I said, semiconductors. And the reason I mention these three things is because they are some of the most highly complex kind of industrial manufacturing that could take place, and it takes many years. It requires a lot of energy. I mean, AI data centers alone require such an abundant amount of energy that we're already seeing. We're seeing constantly articles coming out with communities inside the United States that are being deprived of much needed electricity. And in fact, I think it was in Lake Tahoe. I was reading this article like not so long ago, and Virginia, where they essentially had, their electricity companies had almost basically shut off and decided they're going to be redirecting all their energy towards AI data centers. So will the United States itself doesn't have the energy it needs to meet its own demands, yet somehow we have this prevailing argument that the United States is going to produce enough for itself to fuel Europe, to fuel in terms of oil, right? And but also the Gulf states by taking out competitors and becoming the world's kind of major oil giant. No, it doesn't work like that. And so this is one of the with regards to oil. This is in her becoming a major no oil exporter. This is one of the fundamental issues that I have with this argument, and this argument can also be made, and we can go into that in a little bit with regards to LNG.
Yeah, I'm
Right,
so sorry.
right.
I've got to get running, but thank you so much, Elina. That was fascinating. And if you guys keep talking, I'm definitely going to watch the recording because this has
I
been
am.
great
I am.
so far.
I also have to go, but I'm going to suggest that we do a part two, Elina, because I think we have a lot
Yes.
of questions
Oh
still
yeah,
to go. And
yeah.
me too. I still wanna hear. I have so many questions still, and this is great. But if you're up for that, I hope we can settle for a session number two for very soon.
Of course, we haven't even got to LNG yet, and there's a lot to
Mm.
talk about that
Exactly, exactly,
because
exactly. BRICS and China, and then I was also thinking about clean energy and all these things. But This
clean
this
energy.
this,
Yeah.
this has been excellent. Already an hour. It goes so fast. So let's settle for a round two soon. And thank you for this. This was
Yeah.
very enlightening.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for having me on.
yeah, yes. Sorry for being so abrupt, but there's so much information, and suddenly you realize, oh wow, it's already 1 hour. But I'm gonna email you, Elina. We're gonna plan for a round two. Thank you so much.
Hmm.
Hope to see you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Static crackles, voices rise. Truth breaks through their velvet lies. A screen of fire, a shield of steel. Bedbeat medium makes you feel. No borders, no change. No silence.